Diagnosed with severe respiratory failure, the newborn shepherd pup was marked for euthanasia. But when an old veteran refused to let that tiny life slip away, a miracle began. Inside a freezing cabin, an 8-year-old girl, a grieving soldier, and kind-hearted neighbors united to fight for a pup no one believed would survive. What that fragile dog brought with it would shock the whole town. Stay until the end. You won't believe what happened in that cabin. Before we start, hit like, share, and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from. A thin winter mist drifted through the pine shadows. Inside the small weathered cabin at the edge of the Montana forest, Ethan Ward sat hunched on an old cedar stool, his breath fogging faintly in the chilly air. Ethan was a 72-year-old former combat medic, tall but slightly stooped, with a square jaw softened by age, a salt and smoke beard trimmed close to his cheeks, and eyes the pale blue of ice water, eyes that had seen too much loss to ever fully rest. His hands, broad and lined like cracked earth, trembled subtly whenever memories surged, remnants of the years he spent stitching broken soldiers back together while rarely having time to mend himself. Tonight, however, his attention was pulled to a different kind of battlefield. Bear, his loyal female shepherd of 6 years, lay on a pile of blankets beside the fireplace. She was a large, sable-coated dog with intelligent amber eyes, strong legs that once carried her through rescue drills on the ranch where Ethan adopted her, and a gentle temperament shaped by the quiet routines of life with an old man. Yet now her sides rose and fell sharply, breath hitched from effort as she delivered her litter. 3 tiny pups arrived into the cold cabin air, 2 strong, squirming immediately toward warmth, and a third, much smaller one, weak as a fading ember. The runt lay motionless for a moment before its chest fluttered in a thin, ragged rhythm. Ethan's stomach tightened. The frailty of that sound dragged him back to nights in makeshift medical tents, where he listened to soldiers cling to life on breaths just like this. Bear nudged the tiny pup anxiously, her ears pinned back, a soft whine vibrating through her throat. Ethan stroked her muzzle. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though fear prickled beneath his ribs. The pup was icy cold, its paws limp, its nose barely moist. He wrapped the fragile creature in a dish towel and tucked it inside his faded wool coat, the same coat issued during his last winter deployment, frayed but warm, smelling faintly of pine and wood smoke. The clock on the mantel read 2:14 a.m. Outside, the wind shook the shutters like a warning. Ethan's heart hammered with a clarity he had not felt in years. "Hang on, little one," he whispered, grabbing his truck keys from the hook. "Don't give up now." Bear lifted her head, watching him with raw concern, but she was too exhausted to rise. Ethan gave her a gentle pat, promising without words he would return. The cabin door groaned as it opened to the night. The road to the mountain clinic was dark, empty, and glazed with frost. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel and the other cradling the bundle inside his coat, feeling the faintest quiver of life press against his ribs. Every bump in the road jolted old memories, nights spent rushing injured men through fire-bitten roads, the echo of shouted orders, the hollow guilt of survivors. He muttered to the pup, to himself, to ghosts that never quite left him. When the clinic finally appeared, an old wooden building with a flickering porch light, Ethan burst through the door, boots thudding like thunder. Dr. Grace Hemsworth, a woman in her 50s with a lean frame, iron-gray hair pulled into a tight braid, and the brisk, no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had spent decades patching up wounded wildlife, looked up in alarm. Her face was sharp-featured but not unkind, with small creases around her eyes that deepened when she worried. "Ethan, at this hour?" she asked, stepping forward. He opened his coat to reveal the trembling pup. Respiratory trouble. Weak. Barely breathing. Grace's expression softened with professional sorrow. She carried the pup gently, almost reverently, to the examination table. Minutes dragged by, each one etched into Ethan's chest like a blade. Grace checked temperature, listened to the lungs, shone a pen light across the still-closed eyes. Her brows knit tighter with every test. Finally, she exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling into her shoulders. Severe respiratory infection, critical stage. There's hardly any reflex response. She reached for a clipboard, her voice low but firm, the tone of someone who had delivered this verdict too many times. The kindest option is euthanasia. It would stop the suffering. I can prepare the medication. Ethan watched the tip of her pen descend toward the paper. Something inside him surged, the same fierce instinct that once kept wounded soldiers alive through sheer stubbornness. He placed his hand over the form, surprising even himself with the force behind it. "No," he said, voice gravelly but unwavering. "Don't do that. I'll take the pup home. I'll take responsibility." Grace looked at him long and deeply, seeing the grief etched in the lines of his face, the fire still lit beneath years of loss. Finally, she nodded. "Then, take the medicine. Take the guidelines. But Ethan, you need to understand the chances are almost none." He gathered the pup back into the warmth of his coat. "Chances," he murmured, "don't have to be big. They just have to exist." As he stepped into the cold night again, the tiny heartbeat against his chest felt impossibly small, yet stubborn, like the faintest promise that maybe, just maybe, the dawn would bring more than sorrow. The morning sun filtered through thin gray clouds, casting a soft haze over the cabin's frosted windows. Ethan Ward pushed the door open with his shoulder, cradling the fragile pup inside his coat, and stepped back into the only place he had ever considered home. Bear lay where he had left her the night before, her sable fur illuminated by the faint glow of embers still burning in the hearth. The mother shepherd, exhausted yet alert, lifted her head the moment she sensed him. Bear was large but gentle, with deep amber eyes that seemed capable of understanding even the things Ethan never said aloud. She nudged forward as he knelt beside her, revealing the two healthy pups curled against her belly, their bodies warm, tiny tails flicking as they slept. Ethan slowly unwrapped the runty pup, Little One, though he hadn't said the name out loud yet, and placed it next to its siblings. Bear instinctively pressed her flank against the fragile body, and the two stronger pups shifted closer, instinctively lending warmth as if guided by something older than instinct. Perhaps love, perhaps fate. The inside of the cabin smelled faintly of pine and old wood, with the drying herbs that hung from the rafters brushing softly whenever a breeze crept in. Ethan sat back on the worn rug, his joints aching from the endless night. He brushed a hand over his face, fingers pausing over the deep lines carved by years of responsibility, loss, and loneliness. He couldn't shake the memory of Dr. Grace's voice, the quiet resignation, the way her hand hesitated before signing the form. Her warning still echoed. Chances are almost none. But the tiny heartbeat against his chest on the ride home had been enough. Enough to try. Enough to hope. Ethan dozed in the rocking chair, wrapped in an old army blanket, until a sudden, timid knocking pulled him awake. Peering through the small window, he saw a little girl shivering on the porch. Lily Thompson was 8 years old, small and slender with messy chestnut hair pulled into uneven pigtails. She had big brown eyes set under long, curled lashes, freckles scattered across her nose, and a woolen scarf wrapped too many times around her neck. Lily was known around the neighborhood for her boundless compassion. She brought cookies to elderly neighbors and once spent an entire afternoon trying to coax a limping squirrel to eat sunflower seeds. Despite her young age, she carried a quiet sensitivity shaped by her father's long-term deployment overseas, a reality that made her cling tightly to any creature that needed love. Ethan opened the door, surprised. Lily held a small glass bottle filled with warm goat's milk, steam dancing beneath the cork. "Mom said Bear had puppies," she said, her voice soft but earnest. "And one of them is sick. I thought the baby might need this." Something tightened in Ethan's chest, something warm and aching. He stepped aside. "Come in, Lily." Her boots thumped softly against the wood floor as she crossed the room, eyes widening when she saw Bear and the pups. Lily knelt gently, moving with the cautious reverence of someone entering sacred space. She set the milk bottle down and extended a small hand toward Bear. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're doing so good." Bear sniffed Lily's fingers, then placed her head atop the weak pup, as if explaining without words. "This one needs help." Lily glanced up at Ethan. "Can I feed the baby?" Ethan hesitated, but there was something about her, something true, that eased his worry. "Just a few drops," he said. Lily nodded solemnly as if she had just accepted an important mission. She dipped a cloth into the warm milk and gently held it to little one's mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tiny tongue flicked. Once. Twice. Lily's face lit with a radiant smile. "You see that?" she breathed. Ethan swallowed against the sudden lump in his throat. "Yeah, I see it." Lily visited again the next morning, and the next. Each time she arrived bundled in mismatched sweaters, cheeks pink from the cold, clutching the little bottle like a treasure. She began calling the runt Little One, a name that made Ethan pause each time, simple, tender, and somehow perfect. Her presence lightened the cabin. She talked softly to Bear, stroked the healthy pups, and fed Little One with unwavering patience. Ethan watched from the doorway sometimes, arms crossed, heart fuller than he liked to admit. There was something sacred in how Lily worked, her childish gentleness wrapped around a determination surprisingly strong for such a small girl. As days passed, Bear grew protective, yet trusting around her. The two healthy pups began nudging Little One closer to Bear's warmth, curling around their sibling like tiny guardians. Ethan realized then that hope was no longer just something he carried. It was something that seemed to bloom inside the entire household. And every morning, as Lily gently fed the fragile pup in the glow of the rising sun, Ethan felt the smallest shift inside himself. A loosening of the loneliness, a breath that didn't feel quite so heavy. Little One was still weak, still trembling, still uncertain. But now, the pup was no longer fighting alone, and neither was Ethan. The late afternoon light drifted in through pale clouds, painting faint strokes of gold across Ethan Ward's modest cabin. The warmth from the hearth was steady but soft, just enough to chase away the lingering mountain chill that crept in through the logs. Ethan sat on the floor beside Bear and her litter, rubbing the weary shepherd's shoulders with a tenderness he rarely showed to anyone else. The fragile pup, Little One, lay curled against its mother, its breaths thin and uneven but undeniably present. It was a sound that wrapped itself around Ethan's bruised heart like a whisper of survival. A gentle knock came at the door, unhurried but firm enough to be heard over the crackling fire. Ethan opened it to find Margaret Whitlow standing on the porch. She was a woman in her early 70s with a stout build softened by age, short silver hair cut neatly to her jawline, and a face full of laugh lines that hinted at decades spent mothering not just her own children, but half the neighborhood. Her hazel eyes sparkled beneath round spectacles, and she wore a knitted shawl the color of faded marigolds. Margaret had the sturdy determination of someone who had survived enough winters, literal and emotional, to know how to keep living things warm. In her hands she held a large pot, steam curling from its rim. "I heard Bear whining last night," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, just as she always did with anyone she considered family. "That girl's been through enough. I brought bone stew. Strong stuff, helps with warmth." Ethan managed a tired smile. "Margaret, you didn't have to—" "Nonsense," she interrupted, shooing away his gratitude with a flick of her wrist. "If you let me help, I will. Now move aside before you drop that pup again." She set the pot on the small wooden table, then knelt beside Bear with a grace surprising for her age. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small jar of aromatic herbal salve. something she crafted herself, usually used to ease joint pains or soothe animals recovering from winter frostbite. "Let's help you, sweetheart," she murmured, unscrewing the lid. She rubbed the warm salve gently on Bear's belly, then draped a thick towel over her to hold the heat. Bear exhaled as if relieved, her eyes half closing. Ethan watched in silence, touched by the quiet competence of this woman who seemed to understand healing as naturally as she breathed. Little One's breathing remained fragile, but when Bear shifted, the silver bell on her collar jingled softly, a delicate chime that echoed through the room like the faintest call to life. To Ethan's astonishment, the tiny pup raised its head just slightly toward the sound, its ears twitching. Margaret saw the movement, her voice softening. "That's a fighter, if I've ever seen one." Ethan felt the words settle deep in his chest, heavier than hope, but lighter than fear. The two healthier pups, stockier and more rambunctious, crawled closer to their sibling. They weren't old enough to understand illness, but instinct made them press their small bodies around Little One, forming a warm cocoon of fur. One nudged a bit of spilled milk closer with its nose, clumsy but earnest. Margaret chuckled. "Looks like the whole family's stepping up." Over the next hour, neighbors trickled in as news spread. The closest was Henry Polk, a tall, wiry man in his late 60s with a thin gray mustache and a limp in his left leg from an old logging accident. He had rough hands, a quiet voice, and a habit of rubbing the back of his neck whenever he felt emotional, which he did now, seeing the pups. "Ethan, how's the little fella?" he asked. "Still fighting," Ethan replied. A moment later, June Marsh wandered in, a woman in her 50s with auburn curls and a pleasantly round face. She ran the bakery at the end of the road and carried a basket of fresh rolls still warm from the morning oven. "These are for you," she told Ethan. "You'll forget to eat otherwise." Then came Mr. Irving, the retired postman, short, hunched but cheerful, with his wool cap pulled low and a tin of peppermint candies he always shared during emergencies, even ones involving animals. No one stayed long, but each person paused to look at the tiny pup, offering silently their shared hope. The cabin, once too quiet, now pulsed with gentle voices, footsteps, and warmth, a sense of community Ethan had not felt since before his deployment decades ago. As dusk deepened, Margaret poured a bowl of her stew for Bear, mixing it with cooled broth so it wouldn't burn her tongue. Bear ate softly, her ears flicking each time Little One stirred. Margaret placed a hand on Ethan's arm. Her touch was firm, steady. "You're doing right by them," she said. "Grief tries to make us close our doors, but you're choosing to open yours. That matters." Ethan swallowed hard, her words cut deeper than she knew. Little One shifted, letting out the faintest squeak, a fragile note, yet unmistakably alive. In the soft glow of the lanterns, with neighbors' laughter fading down the path and Bear breathing steadily at his side, Ethan felt something unfamiliar warming his chest. It wasn't victory, it wasn't certainty, but it was life. And, for now, life was enough. The morning light seeped gently through the thin curtains, bringing with it a crisp scent of frost-kissed pine. Ethan Ward stood in the center of his modest living room, holding a tin of dried herbs in one calloused hand. His tall frame, still broad-shouldered despite age, cast a long shadow across the wooden floor. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened in concentration as he sprinkled a pinch of mint leaves onto a small ceramic dish placed beside the pup's milk bowl. Mint, fresh and sharp, was meant to encourage alertness. Near the hearth, a strip of pine resin burned in a tiny clay cup, releasing the familiar, homey fragrance of warm forests. And beside Little One's woven basket, a satchel of dried lavender hung gently from a hook. The lavender's soothing sweetness drifted through the air, weaving itself into the heartbeat of the cabin. Ethan had arranged these scents not because they were guaranteed to work, but because instinct told him that the tiny fragile pup needed every gentle push toward life that he could offer. Bear watched him with soft, amber eyes, her head resting on her paws. Her silver bell jingled each time she breathed deeply, a subtle chime that seemed to echo through the very bones of the room. The two healthy pups bounded around Bear's legs, energetic tails swishing, occasionally bumping into Ethan's boots as they explored their world with playful determination. When Lily arrived, as she always did shortly after sunrise, her cheeks were flushed rosy from the cold. Today she wore a pale yellow coat too big for her small frame, with pockets bulging from the snacks and trinkets she always brought, just in case. She slipped off her mittens and knelt beside Bear, brushing her tangled chestnut hair behind one ear. "Good morning, Bear," she whispered. She then leaned closer to the basket. "Good morning, little one. You ready to try again today?" Bear lifted her head and shook it lightly, making the silver bell chime. The sound floated through the air, settling around the basket like an invitation. To Ethan's amazement, little one twitched. First a slight movement, then a slow, shaky stretch. The pup's tiny muzzle lifted toward the warmth of Bear's body, guided not by sight but by sound and scent. Lily gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. "Ethan! Look, look!" Ethan knelt beside her, eyes widening. Little one's small legs pushed weakly against the blanket, inching toward Bear's chest. It was not graceful. It was not fast. But it was movement. Real movement. The two healthy siblings circled around little one, yipping softly as if cheering. One nudged little one forward, gentle and patient. The other pressed its warm side against the pup's back, bracing it from falling backward. Margaret appeared at the doorway, her shawl wrapped tightly around her thick frame. Her short silver hair glowed faintly under the morning light. She leaned on the doorframe with folded arms, her hazel eyes shining. "Look at them," she murmured, smiling. "The whole family is doing its part. If that isn't a miracle, I don't know what is." Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling something loosen in his chest. He had spent many years believing in nothing. Not in fate, not in healing, not even in himself. But watching the pups knit themselves around little one in a web of instinctive love stirred something deeper than words. An hour later, the familiar rumble of a truck outside signaled the arrival of Dr. Grace Hemsworth. She stepped inside the cabin, wearing her dark winter coat, her iron-gray braid tucked under a wool cap. Her sharp, knowledgeable eyes scanned the room as she removed her gloves. "Morning, Ethan. Morning, Lily. Margaret." She approached the basket, kneeling down and examining little one with practiced tenderness. She checked reflexes, temperature, breathing. Her brow furrowed, then slowly lifted. "It's responding," she said, almost disbelieving. "This pup shouldn't be able to move this much yet." Lily puffed out her chest proudly. "We've all been helping." Dr. Grace glanced at Ethan, and for the first time in many years, maybe since she had first opened her clinic, her expression softened into a smile that reached her eyes. "Well," she said, exhaling, "whatever you all are doing, it's working. I'll admit it. This is far beyond what I expected." She paused, staring at the pup as it inched closer to Bear. "Sometimes," she added, voice lower, "medicine doesn't explain everything." Bear nudged little one closer, laying her head protectively over the pup's fragile body. Lily placed a hand over Ethan's arm, her small fingers warm and firm. Margaret stepped further into the room, her sturdy presence settling like a comforting blanket. Outside, neighbors' distant voices carried across the cold wind, checking if the pup had improved, asking if Bear was eating, offering soups and kind words. The whole neighborhood had somehow woven itself into the fabric of this tiny fight for life. And as Ethan looked at the circle around him, Bear, little one, Lily, Margaret, Dr. Grace, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Certainty. The pup was choosing life, and they were choosing it with him. The first true breath of spring drifted across the Montana tree line, soft and cool, carrying the scent of thawing earth and pine sap. Inside Ethan Ward's modest wooden cabin, the air felt different. Lighter, warmer, tinged with something he hadn't felt in years: quiet triumph. The fragile pup, who once hovered between life and death, now rested in Ethan's hands with a steadier heartbeat and brighter eyes. Sparrow, that was the name Ethan had chosen 2 mornings earlier, whispered gently into a tiny ear while Bear watched protectively. He chose it because the pup's breaths, once fragile as feathers, now carried a kind of fluttering courage. Sparrow blinked up at him, the cloudiness gone from its dark brown eyes. Where once there had been a dull glaze, now there was clarity, soft and curious, like a creature seeing the world for the first time. Lily arrived just as the sun began spilling through the cabin window. She burst through the door wearing a sky-blue jacket splattered with mud from skipping across puddles. Her chestnut hair bounced wildly behind her, tangled from running. When she saw Sparrow lift its head, her face bloomed with radiant joy. "It looked at me," she squealed, hands clasped together. "Ethan, it looked right at me." Sparrow, startled by her voice, tilted its head toward the sound, an action so small yet so miraculous that Ethan felt something swell tight in his throat. Bear, whose sable coat glistened in the morning light, nudged Sparrow gently with her muzzle. The pup responded by pressing into her warmth. The 2 older siblings, now sturdier and far more energetic, tumbled around them like furry comets. One nipped playfully at Sparrow's tail, while the other dashed around the room before returning to bump its head affectionately against the tiny pup, as if reminding it that it had a place in this world. Margaret Whitlow arrived next, stepping across the porch with her usual mix of determination and grandmotherly concern. She wore a soft lavender blouse beneath her knitted shawl, and her hazel eyes sparkled the moment she spotted Sparrow standing, wobbly but upright, near Bear's side. "Look at you," she said warmly, bending with surprising agility for her stout frame. "Aren't you just a miracle in fur?" She gathered Bear's head in her hands, pressing her cheek against the shepherd's. Bear leaned into her touch, her tail thumping steadily. Margaret had become more than a neighbor. She had become the pup's honorary grandmother, offering advice, warmth, and the kind of calm that only long-lived women carried. Soon, the rest of the community trickled in. Henry Polk limped up the walkway carrying a small wooden toy he carved himself, a tiny pup with mismatched wooden ears. June Marsh brought a basket of warm honey biscuits, their sweet scent filling the room. Mr. Irving arrived last, short and round with his wool cap askew, holding a tin of peppermint candies he insisted were good luck for all living things. They gathered in the cabin like a small congregation. The pups darted among their legs, and laughter, genuine, bubbling laughter, filled the space that had once endured years of silence. Sparrow, strengthened by the warmth of its siblings and the endless care of Bear, toddled toward the middle of the room. Its small paws patted clumsily across the wooden floor, and the room fell quiet as everyone watched. Sparrow paused near Ethan's boots. Then, slowly, bravely, it lifted its face, eyes bright and full of life. Ethan's breath caught. The world seemed to pause. Then Sparrow barked, just once, a tiny, squeaky sound, full of triumph. Lily clapped. Margaret let out a soft gasp. Even Henry brushed a hand across his eyes, pretending dust had blown in. And Ethan. He felt something that broke him open and stitched him back together all at once. When the neighbors drifted outside, gathering beneath the early spring sun, Sparrow scampered in circles around Bear's legs, alive, energetic, impossibly victorious. The siblings chased after Sparrow, tumbling in a flurry of paws and joy. Ethan stepped out onto the porch and lowered himself onto the wooden steps. The sunlight painted his worn face in soft gold, revealing lines carved by sorrow but now brightened by hope. He looked at the pups, at Bear, at the community that had risen around him like a family. His voice came out quiet, but it carried. "I thought miracles were for young men, for people with time left. But sometimes a miracle is just a whole lot of hearts trying to save one small life." Margaret squeezed his shoulder as she passed. Lily leaned against his side, and Sparrow bounded across the yard, fearless at last. It was not just a happy ending. It was a beginning. For Sparrow, for Bear, for the siblings who would guard their runt like loyal knights. And for Ethan, who had found his heart beating again inside a tiny, once fragile body. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not thunderous signs from the heavens, but quiet moments when broken things choose to rise again. Sparrow's story reminds us that God often works through ordinary hands and everyday kindness, weaving hope from the smallest threads. In a world that can feel rushed and restless, may we learn to pause, to notice the fragile lives around us, and to believe that a single act of compassion can change everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that light still exists. Leave a comment to tell us where hope has shown up in your own life, and subscribe so you never miss another tale of grace and resilience. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide you through every valley and every sunrise.